You know, as I look around and I see the rows in between and how we stay away from each other, I think of what holiness meant in biblical days. When you think of holiness today, you think of holy as something you want to get close to. The Torah scrolls, the Western Wall, we want to touch it. In the ancient world, though, holiness was dangerous. And you didn't want to touch things that were holy if you weren't eligible to touch them. One could die. So I'd like to suggest that we call Kol Nidre a holy night anyway, but especially tonight because we're reminded of the sanctity of our own lives and how distance preserves and protects us, that each of us is that much holier tonight because of our lives, because of our capacity to be here, and because we recognize that of utmost importance to each of us is the health and safety of the people around us, which is what it really means to wear that mask. I find myself often, as a rabbi, walking into rooms filled with sorrow. In this case, I walked into a room when the family's matriarch had died and her daughters were sitting on the couch holding hands, her sons with their arms around their spouses, the grandchildren sat on the floor. I sit in my place in a chair, open my tablet, my pen, ready to write, and I start with the questions that I always ask. How would she describe her childhood? What was she like as a mother, as a grandmother? What were your favorite times with her? Slowly, they begin to speak. They tell their stories. Of course, there's laughter and there are tears, and I'm writing frantically because I want to make sure to get the bits and pieces of their memories down so I can recount them accurately when I tell her story. At times, they bicker good-naturedly. It wasn't like that. It didn't happen that way. What do you mean? I was there. I saw it. No, I was there too. It didn't happen that way. You've been there. You know how that works. And after an hour or so, to be honest, I'm tired because careful listening takes work. And sometimes as I'm listening, it seems there's a bit more to the story, and I know I have to push just a little harder to get behind the story, to learn a bit more about them. I'm trying to understand, after all, the nuances of human being, of love, of family dynamics, and I'm trying to capture it so that I can turn it into the words I'm going to share and do this woman and her family justice and offer the appropriate respect. I rarely walk out of those times unchanged. I mean, how can you sit with a family in a moment like that and not walk out profoundly different than when you walked in? After all these years, 30 years, hundreds of stories, I've learned lessons that I take into my own life from sitting with you in your homes or in my office, or these days over Zoom, hearing you talk about your loved ones. I hope my own character is shaped by your stories. I thought about that. How do you capture that in description? Martin Buber, the great philosopher, he had a word for it. He called those moments of profound engagement, I-thou, a time when we truly meet another without judgment, with love, with appreciation, with care and concern. And then if just for a short time, we enter into a relationship of such depth that both of us walk out transformed. So as I did my own cheshbon hanefesh, an accounting of my soul for the holy days, I thought about the state of my soul as a husband, as a parent, a friend, a rabbi, a citizen. And I thought about Buber's I-thou connection, and I came to understand something about myself. My wife would appreciate this. I need to listen better. Without judgment, with curiosity, and I don't think I'm alone, because I think too many of us fail at listening. We fail to listen with love, with compassion, with understanding, and it's as much a pandemic as this COVID-19. Because it's the root cause of so much of the anger and hostility in our society. It's the core of the rage that leads to the yelling, the posting, the vicious tweeting. We're not listening to each other. We're shouting at each other. Now, we listen long enough to refute or applaud if we agree. We listen long enough to condemn or to condone. But I believe that in our determination to be right, or to win, or to debase, or to troll, we've ended up closing our hearts to each other. And that's a tragedy for this community and a tragedy for our country. How often do we listen to another person to understand and to know? That's what I try to do when I sit with a family as they talk about their loved one. I'm truly trying to embrace them with my open heart. Maria Popova is a blogger. She's a thinker, a writer. Her blog is called Brain Pickings. It shows up in my mailbox about once a week. She wrote, "We have ceased to meet one another as whole persons and instead collide as fragments. We've become colliding fragments. Bang! My words crash into yours. Bang! Your post flashes on my screen. Crash! Our ideas collide like meteors in outer space, disintegrating each other." That's no way to build community. That's the way to tear it down piece by piece by piece. If we're serious about meeting the problems in our world, if we're serious about meeting the problems as Jews, countering anti-Semitism, sustaining Israel, about teaching our children to love their identities as Jews, we can't continue to have these verbal collisions. And if we're serious about building this nation that provides us with such a secure home, we've got to stop colliding with those whose vision of the future is different from our own. We Jews, we really once knew how to listen. It's, so to speak, in our DNA. And we can, I think, once again, learn and set examples for the world of how to disagree with love, how to challenge with respect, and how to embrace an ideological mosaic with sincerity. Centuries ago, the great Talmudic academies led by rabbis Hillel and Shammai often took diametrically opposing views on issues of Jewish law. One said, ours is the right way, ours is the answer, the way to go as a Jew. The other said, no, ours is the correct interpretation of Jewish law. And year after year, they disagreed and disagreed and disagreed until finally it said, a divine voice called out from the heavens and said, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chaim. These and these are the words of the living God. And the voice went on and it said, but the word of Hillel prevails. The ancient scholars asked, as they do, if Elu ve'elu, these and these are both the words of the living God, how come Hillel prevails? And they analyzed and they said, well, it's because Hillel was agreeable and forgiving. It's because Hillel taught their school's position as well as that of the other, of Shammai. And when they wrote their decisions down, they also recorded those of Shammai, but not with derision, not with rancor and ridicule, but with honor and respect. Hillel wasn't recognized because every judgment was somehow better than Shammai's. No. He was recognized because he was respectful. His school was respectful. His scholars honored the other. And even when they disagreed, the scholars listened. They weren't colliding fragments. They were loving and respectful adversaries. More importantly, Hillel's scholars are praised not because they stubbornly stood by their positions, and this is important, but because very often, when they were met with the arguments of Shammai that made sense to them, they changed their minds. Now, if you heard Rabbi Noble's sermon on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and it's online, I recommend you listen to it, he used this story as well. And what you'll notice is our sermons are not the same, but they rhyme. And that's a good thing because they're complementary, so I invite you to listen online. But now to a modern example of how listening changed far more than one life. The columnist, David Brooks, maybe you've heard of him, he had it all. Millions read his words, thousands came to hear him speak and learned from his opinions about current events and the moral issues of our society. He received huge honoraria. He was at the top of his game, or so he thought, until his life fell apart. His marriage ended. His kids went off to college. He was all alone. He looked out from his broken home and realized that what he thought counted for success wasn't success at all. After all, he spent his life speaking at people. He'd write his words in solitude. He'd fly into a city, speak before adoring crowds, and then he'd eat dinner alone. He had no real relationships. And when he found himself in that valley of despair and loneliness, there was no one to reach a hand in to help him out. It was then that he understood that he had to reweave the fabric of his life. And he realized that reweaving required more than speaking. It required speaking less and listening more. So he started with his kids, where he decided that it was a good thing to offer far less advice and far less judgment. Parents, good advice from David Brooks. And to be far more patient and accepting. And then he started listening to Americans of all shapes and stripes and all political persuasions and all religious denominations and perspectives. And he stepped down off the podium and he stepped into the lives of people. And he experienced a reweaving. And that reweaving of his own inspired him to create a movement. You can probably guess the name. He called it Weave. And he's determined to engage Americans in the reweaving of the frayed and torn social fabric that used to bind communities, that used to strengthen individuals, that used to elevate lives. Of course, listening is not the only way we encounter people whose ideas are different from our own. We can read the thoughtful observations on paper or on our screens of deep thinkers whose ideas are challenging. And here again, this written perspective of discord and dissonance, it's not an aberration in our tradition, actually. It's at its very core. I spent a lot of time in my career studying the Bible. And what I've learned over all these years is that the Bible is a rich mosaic of actually contradictory often and complicated and different ideas. Parts are written in Iran, parts are written in Babylonia, parts are written in Egypt, parts are written in Israel, and every single author writing in a different time in history has a different perspective, and they're all together in one book, and I have to tell you, these ideas don't collide. They blend beautifully. And throughout the text, there's a particular word that's repeated over 170 times. Shema, listen. Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, demands the Bible. To be Israel is to be a nation of listeners, not the nation of talkers that it seems like so many of us, well, we're Jews. That's what we do, right? Listening to divergent voices and seeking to understand different perspectives, reading divergent literature and allowing it to challenge us doesn't make us less intelligent. It actually makes us wiser. Stubborn adherence to one's ideas, that's not a sign of wisdom. Quite the contrary. That's reflective of a small mind. Now, I want to be clear. There is a limit to listening. Rabbi Sari, Rabbi Laffer introduced me to the words of James Baldwin, which I think capture it importantly. We can disagree and still love each other, wrote Baldwin, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and in denial of my humanity and right to exist. I'm going to read it one more time. It's that important. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Profound words. When we listen to understand, when we listen to find common ground, when we listen with the possibility that our own ideas might be changed, when we listen with the awareness that our own knowledge might be limited, when we listen so that we can entertain divergent ideas in our mind and walk out confused a little bit, that's a good thing. When we listen to the members of our community with love, we will surely increase our wisdom, not diminish it. Our commitment to listening is critical, especially if we want to engage the next generation of Jews. It is fruitless to lament their apathy or decry their Jewish and secular choices because they may not be our own. And we can't talk at them. We can't yell stridently or invoke the specter of the Holocaust as a means to bring them in. It's not going to bring them in. It's going to push them away. We've got to instead listen, meet them where they are, hear what they have to say, and be willing to adapt this 3,000-year-old tradition to meet their desires, their interests, and their passions. You see, with careful and empathic listening that seeks to understand and embrace, we will weave our community together in such a way that it will make us stronger, and it will make us better able to confront the challenges to Jewish life and to human existence that pervade our world. So the first step for reweaving is listening. The next is Hillel's practice of honoring the other. And the last is that personal transformation that comes from deeply engaging others. That's Martin Buber's I, Thou. So here's what I'm committed to doing this year, and hopefully for the rest of my life. To ask more questions and actually wait for the answer. To read more things that challenge my ideas. To avoid verbal collisions, whether on social media, in person, or even in my writings here at the temple. To engage rather than convince. To see each encounter with another as a chance to learn and grow and expand my own ability to think more deeply. Of course, I wouldn't be standing here in front of you sharing these words if it wasn't to invite you to do the same. This year, I invite you to do more listening than talking. This year, I invite you to ask more questions. This year, I welcome you to seek ways to engage rather than confront. This year, together, we can reweave the fabric of our community, and it can start with this congregation. And I promise, I'll fall short sometimes, but I will do my best to walk with you on your journey. And so let's begin by listening to the voice that draws us in, wakes us up, and calls us to action. Please rise. Tekiah Gadola. Amen. Thank you.